I'm sure you do. I'm sure you do. My ass. Dr. Kaplan.
A Verbo is for sharing all kinds of moments. From teeing off.
Not that again.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the group therapy course. In this lesson, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about group dynamics. Group dynamics, or what you might hear referred to as process variables. And group dynamics or group process variables are factors within a person that could influence group outcomes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen. Give me 1 second. Let's pull it up. And we're going to go through it.
Yes, sir.
All right. So when we talk about group dynamics, 1 second. I just adopted a kitten, so my kitten's going to steal the show. All right, so in concept, so group dynamics are, as I said, factors within a person or within the group that impact how we relate to one another.
Yes, sir.
So when we think about it, the structure of the group, it guides interaction among group members. We also look at the social process by which people interact with the group environment. And we look at factors such as personality, power, and behaviors, individual behaviors, group behaviors, as well as group leader functioning and how that plays a role. So when we talk about group dynamics, there are different kind of behaviors at play. Now, I will say that I am using slides that I did not write. This comes from a training I went to on group dynamics, so you'll notice that they have the British spelling of behaviors. But in any event, I wanted to, give credit and not take credit for someone else's intellectual property. All right. So, task behavior. So when we talk about the goals of the group,
Hey, Diana.
Initiating is a task behavior. Initiating that would.
How's it going? I think you guys see some of this eclipse now too, but I can't remember if Michigan is in part of the total eclipse. I did see that Nikita said you got registered, so that was exciting. I was trying to finish up here quickly because of the total eclipse. But there was one other quick update on group counseling with kids and teens. Oh, nice. You see it at 2:30. Okay, cool. So it starts here at 1:53. The sun's at least 99% covered at 3:09, and then I guess it goes on until like 4 maybe. So I had this one thing on kids, group counseling with kids, and wanted to answer questions about the paper. So yeah, the main reason I have you guys turn it in early is just to not have you hold it off to the last minute. Because the time is coming up fast. I'm glad you got into Nikita's class because that's coming up very soon too. And did we have to register you for anything else was the last question, but I'll roll this video otherwise if there weren't too many questions. Okay, cool. All right, well, fire away if there's any other questions.
Welcome back to this US Open office plan.
Miller just lobbed a message way over Jones's head using some technical
Be related to K to 12.
Sweet.
But I did have a slide on the counseling center. So we're gonna talk about children, adolescents, and the school process. So this will be one of our special populations talks, right? So without further ado, let me share my screen, if it'll let me. All right, so our first learning objective is to describe the various types of groups and considerations that affect running groups or conducting groups in school settings. We'll discuss things like recruiting, screening, selecting participants. We'll talk about various guidelines and best practices when running groups with children and adolescents. We'll talk a little bit about the various therapeutic factors linked to play therapy and how it's applied to children and adolescents. We'll talk about developmental themes in adolescence. Most of it will be grounded in Ericksonian work and the concept of the identity crisis and how that affects teenagers. Then we'll discuss the various challenges you might experience when running groups with adolescents, guidelines for helping adolescents deal with anger and conflict, which is fairly common in adolescence. We'll talk briefly about structure of groups in counseling centers. So this lecture provides a general format. It can be applied in many different ways. The first two are very concrete and clear cut. So discussing how to apply groups to children and adolescents, that's pretty clear cut. And the application to counseling centers and university centers, that's fairly clear cut, it'll be covered. But these principles can be applied to private practices or community mental health centers, whether they be public or private. So, in general, when we run a group, we put an emphasis on prevention and intervention. When we talk about prevention, what we're really talking about here is primary prevention. And if you've taken a psychopathology course, you've probably heard of primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. Well, primary prevention is to address an issue before it occurs. It's an issue that you can anticipate and you address it before it becomes a problem. Whereas secondary and tertiary prevention are more or less intervention strategies once the problem has emerged. So the intervention, an intervention can happen in an early stage of development. So you can address drugs and alcohol in a group setting before kids are using drugs, or when they first start using drugs, or after they've developed a substance use disorder and it's interfered with their life. So tertiary prevention is after it's become a significant problem. Now, when we run groups, we want to target before it occurs or along that pathway, early stages or later stage, in a way to promote student development, healthy functioning, and help them navigate their activities of daily living. What we find is that smaller groups are incredibly important when working in school settings. And I know I've talked to you about 8 to 12 being the range of acceptability for groups, but when it comes to school, especially in early childhood, middle childhood, and adolescence, you might consider 6 to 8, which is smaller than a traditional group, but that also gives each person more space to participate. So we see research suggests that smaller groups are better. We also want to make sure that the groups are doing what they're supposed to, which is to help develop as a full functioning person. And that includes their physical domain, their cognitive domain, and their socio-emotional domain. So you want to make sure that it helps the full person. Now, I'll give you an example where we've seen a lot of research. When working with children on the autism spectrum, if a child is not in a mainstream setting or classroom, it's not uncommon for them to have a 6-to-1 ratio. That's 6 kids to 1 teacher, right? Or an 8-to-1 ratio. And you might ask yourself, well, why not the 25 kids that are in a standard classroom? Well, it's the same principle. Smaller groups results in more individualized attention, and that results in better outcomes. So that's important. Now, group settings or group therapy in school settings, better yet, tend to be brief, highly structured, whether it be through a psychoeducational or cognitive behavioral orientation. They tend to be very problem and solution focused. So you might remember earlier in this semester, I talked about solution focused brief therapy, right? The group itself tends to be more homogeneous. So the more similarity helps the therapeutic alliance, especially if you're going to have a few sessions. So the shorter the duration of the group, the more important it is to have a homogeneous membership. I already said that the orientations tend to be CBT or psychoeducational. Now, when it comes to dealing with more severe mental illness or severe problems, that usually is not going to happen in a group therapy setting for schools. It's not the setting for that. It's not uncommon if you have severe and persistent mental illness that you're trying to address. So things like schizophrenia or whatnot, you're not going to do that in a school setting. You're going to refer them out to either an outpatient clinic or an inpatient hospital, depending on how regressed they are at that point. So understanding the level of care that you can provide is going to be important, right? Because school counselors, you're focusing on schoolwork, friendships, bullying, things like that. But severe mental illness, you're not going to be able to do in a school setting. So you need to know when it's time to refer out or when it's time to refer to a higher level of care. And when I say higher level of care, it's because that individual needs more attention or the issue is more severe than you can provide an intervention for in the school setting. So referrals, like I said, can be an outpatient clinic for weekly therapy. It could be an inpatient hospitalization in the cases of schizophrenia or suicidal intent and plan. It could be a social services agency if there's some issue related to their home life. So you need to know when to do a referral, and you need to make it part of your practice to have a list of referral resources for each of these domains. I have, for my independent practice, a community mental health agency in all 5 boroughs. I have a recommended psychiatrist for all 5 boroughs. I have inpatient hospitals that I recommend to in all 5 boroughs. I have social services contact for all 5 boroughs that I have just in case I need to refer out. So when you're building your practice, however you're doing it, you need to have these resource sheets to make sure that if they need higher level of care, you do that. All right. So developing the proposal, you want to make sure that your goals and purposes are expressed clearly. Now here's the deal. This proposal is oftentimes in a school setting going to be reviewed by the principal and or the assistant principal, as well as the guidance counselor. And I know I'm going to say this later, but you want to make sure you have the blessing of the administration for whatever proposal you're going to do. Because if something goes down, if something goes wrong, and you didn't show them your proposal, then you're leaving yourself on the hook. So make sure that the proposal is written well, the goal and the purposes are clearly explained. Make sure that you get the blessing of the administration. Make sure that the rationale, the need for the group is clear. Make sure how the children are going to benefit, or the adolescents are going to benefit from participating, is clear. And as with all groups, you want to make sure your targeted interventions, procedures, and evaluations are clearly listed. Now, I've said this before, very little of this is new, except for the fact that you want to get the blessing of other people. And this is a good example why you would write a proposal, not just for my class, but in agency work, in school-based settings, you're going to need another person's approval. So you also want to demonstrate that whatever stated gains they're going to get are accomplished. So you want to make sure that you can assess your outcomes using an evaluation and your documentation is on point. So as with all other groups, you have collective goals and individualized goals. If we were to think about today's session that we did, we have an overarching goal of the session was to address various aspects of stress and allow you to pick where you wanted to go. And we picked school-based stress to focus on. But notice how even though collectively we're all focused on school-based stress, each of you were assigned unique homework. You're going to come back next week and report what you did and the effect it had on your mood. And if we were writing a session note, we would chart that next week for your personal file. Now, just to give you an idea, my memory isn't perfect, so I took notes, right? I took notes, very brief notes, as to what you said and how it fit into the group. So when you work towards your individual goals, we need to be able to document progress. You also need to develop an attendance policy. Similar to other groups, it's important, but here, because this is happening in a school setting, you might be pulling a person out of another class in order to run this group. It's not uncommon for this to happen. The period that's most common to pull someone out is their lunch period, or if they had a free period, that one, so that it doesn't interfere with their academic curriculum. But what happens if someone has a test and they can't come? You want to develop a student-friendly attendance policy. You also want to address when a person just doesn't show up, right? They're in school, there's nothing wrong, but they don't show up. How do you handle that? And then you also want to provide an orientation for the parents. Because you're working with minors, you need to have both the consent of the parent, and depending on the age, if you're working with preteens and teenagers, you also need the approval of the child to participate in a group. Both parties have to sign. But you want to provide an orientation to the parents for several reasons. One is so that they know what you want to accomplish, what their child is expected to get out of it. But you also want to reinforce, even before they sign the consent form, that just because they signed their child up doesn't mean they have access to what their child said. And that's going to be very important to tell parents, because, hey, what Johnny and I speak about, you don't have access to. It's protected information. But I'm their parent. I understand. But in order for them to feel safe, they can't have to worry. They shouldn't have to worry about me sharing with you. Otherwise, maybe they won't be honest about, let's say, there are issues that they have with you as a parent. Are they going to bring that forward if I have to report back to you? All right. So you want to know your state laws with regard to working with minors. What I'm talking to you is New York State law. The laws differ from state to state in terms of who signs the consent form, who doesn't, who has access to the information. You definitely want to make sure that. Now, you want to emphasize confidentiality, but there are limits to confidentiality. So you don't want to tell them that everything they say is going to be confidential, because that's not true. In theory, if the school bills the insurance, then the fact that you went to that session, the fact that there is some diagnosis, the insurance company needs to know that. So you can't keep billing related matters confidential. You can't keep court orders confidential. If the judge orders you to appear and talk about something, you have to appear. Kids need to know this. Teenagers need to know this. If there's any form of abuse, neglect, or maltreatment, you're a mandated reporter. Kids need to know that if there's suspected abuse, neglect, or maltreatment, you have to report that to social services. So that's important, right? And abuse comes in three forms: physical, emotional, sexual. Neglect comes in a form of school-based neglect. Let's say the parent's not making sure the kid goes to school, and the kid is just staying home and not going to school for a month on. Well, you have to report that. If you're getting high with your parents, that's reportable. And you get the idea. So kids need to know abuse, neglect, maltreatment. You're a mandated reporter, so you have to report that. If they're suicide or a homicide, you have to breach confidentiality. As it relates to suicidal, I have to care about you even when you think nobody cares about you. I have to love you even when you feel you're unlovable, right? So if you're suicidal, I have to protect you. If you're homicidal, then you're bound by Tarasoff, and each state has their own guidelines with Tarasoff law, the ethics, right? But if someone is suicidal or homicidal, you breach confidentiality. You have to report that both to authorities, and if there is a specified target, the target, so that they can protect themselves from harm. Now, so I've listed these things, and you would tell the child these things, and you want to explain to them what is confidential, what's not confidential, because I've listed everything. If it's not any of those things, it remains confidential. Now, you need to get permission from the parent and the child. You need to communicate what your expectation is of those in your group. You want to emphasize confidentiality to the extent. So if you're dealing with a teenager, let's say that the teenager is engaging in risky drug use. Do I report them? Let's say they're buying cocaine. Well, that's illegal, right? But you do not work for law enforcement, right? As long as the parent isn't getting high with the child, then that's not reportable. That stays confidential the same way if you're working with an adult and they were part of, I don't know, the mafia, or they're engaging in tax fraud. You wouldn't share that with anyone. You don't have a responsibility to snitch on them, so to speak. Only if there's an imminent harm to the person themselves or another person. So you want to make sure that they know that they can talk about activities that they're doing that might not be legal, and there's a safety there. And it doesn't go back to the parents, even though they signed the consent form. Now, we want to think about practical considerations like the size of the group, which we talked about, shrinking it down a little bit. We want to talk about the setting, some of the limitations of things happening in school is that these are going to be their peers, the same way you're each other's peers at the university. People are learning about one another. So you want to think about how to manage that. You want to remain neutral as much as possible. Do not judge. Use exercises and techniques that will open people up and talk, but remain open-minded and flexible, right? So that's very, very important. And you would be surprised, but people develop strong attachments to you. Even though the group might go for 15 or 16 sessions, they're going to miss the group when the group is over. So you want to prepare people for termination. So if it's a 12-week group, maybe you want to start preparing week 9 or 10. If it's a 15-week group, maybe you'll start week 12. Or a 16-week group, maybe week 12, but you're spacing it out so people can adjust with the process of saying goodbye to one another. Now, play therapy. Play therapy is an incredible technique when working with children and adolescents. It's received tremendous popularity. I know when I talked about various theoretical models, I mentioned play therapy and Jacob Moreno and the concept of psychodrama. The nice thing about play therapy is it gives you an opportunity to discuss things in the natural language of the child in a non-threatening way. So I remember with one person I did like a family model where I had figurines of each member of the family. And I asked him to lay out the members of the family in a way that best reflects their experience. And they had...
All right, I see. Oh yeah, you got field. I want to give you guys a chance because they said in 20 minutes that eclipse does start here. I think it's a little later up there, but we'll finish this one Wednesday. If any of you still need to come in and present or ask questions, I'll see you Wednesday, or just send an email and I'll see you after the eclipse. Have a good one.